remain the envy of every future Roman general. Then there is the legacy he left administratively. He came to power inheriting your Lord and God Domitian's centralized autocracy, and left behind a substantially devolved principate that relied on the sound judgment of provincial governors and the input of the Senate. In all his letters with Pliny, he stressed over and over again that the guiding principle of all that they did should be the welfare of the people. Ruling was not about living a lavish life or indulging egotistical power trips. It was about guaranteeing that your subjects not only survive in a cold, hard world, but thrive in it. These principles would guide the policies of his successors, and Trajan's model of enlightened despotism would see the empire reach its full potential in the decades to come. In this, though, his legacy was all too fleeting, and the inevitable slip from positive monarchy to negative tyranny came just 60 years later. But for the next little while, all would be well with the world, thanks to the wise precedent Trajan set. His final legacy, though, was his choice of successor. Just as Nerva had balanced all of his missteps by bringing Trajan into the imperial fold, Trajan himself would put the cherry on the top of an already brilliant career by naming his former ward Hadrian as heir. Hadrian is on the short list of all-time greatest emperors himself, and the seamless transition from the one to the other turned the whole first third of the 2nd century into one bright, shiny package. But the trick to this final legacy is that Trajan may not have been the one behind it at all. We'll get into the early years of the next emperor's biography next week, but for now, let it suffice to say that Trajan and his wife Pompeia had been the boy's guardian after Hadrian's father died, and Pompeia was enormously fond of him. There is speculation, bordering on confirmed fact, that when Trajan died in Cilicia in 117, he had not yet named an heir, and that he may have intended power to transfer to one of the generals that he had left in charge of the armies in the east when he made his way back to Rome. Pompeia, though, had long lobbied for Hadrian, and when Trajan died without leaving explicit instructions, there is suspicion that she manufactured fake orders stipulating the dead emperor's posthumous adoption of her favorite, Hadrian. While not quite as awesome as Edith Wilson's secret presidency, Pompeia's clandestine plot to put Hadrian on the throne was a plot that bore fruit for Rome for the next 20 years and cemented her own legacy as a woman of far-sighted wisdom. Next week, we'll begin to unpack the fruits of Pompeia's labors and introduce an emperor who embodied the virtues of a Renaissance man, equally skilled in war and poetry and philosophy and rhetoric and architecture, and whose mind raced daily with ways to improve and refine everything that surrounded him. It should come as no surprise, then, that the legacy of such a learned and impressive leader is generally, Hadrian? Yeah, didn't he, build a wall or something? This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, Rome, that again is audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you will qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book that you downloaded. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscriptions options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to recommend picking up The Spartacus War by Barry Strauss, a new take on the old slave revolt that made Pompey famous and made Crassus mad at Pompey. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 81, The Greekling. The Roman Empire had just enjoyed 20 years of wise and beneficial stewardship when the tragic but inevitable news arrived that the Emperor Trajan was dead. Even his contemporaries realized that they were living under the best emperor since Augustus, and fears about what came next filtered through every level of society. With Trajan being so great and all, it's pretty reasonable to assume that whoever succeeds him is going to be worse. Maybe not much worse, but it's going to be a step backwards. You can't get better than Optimus. It's a logical impossibility. And who knows, maybe his successor will be a lot worse. It's happened before. Compounding everyone's fears was the fact that Trajan had paid almost no attention to the issue of succession publicly, which also meant that, hooray, another round of civil wars just might be how we determine who the eventual ruler, who will inevitably be worse than Trajan, will be. Sweet. The anxiety that surrounded Trajan's day-to-day health was palpable, and when he began to seriously deteriorate in 117, his closest advisors began to take seriously the consequences of his death. Would it be possible to find and name an heir who would be acceptable to all the various aristocratic factions, and who wouldn't bollocks up the whole thing once he got into power? Obviously, no one we find is going to be as good as Trajan, so who can we dig up who will be the least bad choice? Names were bandied about, but Trajan's influential wife, Pompeia Plotina, worked behind the scenes to ensure that everyone understood that the only man who could reasonably succeed the dead emperor was her former ward, Publius Aelius Hadrianus. Trajan himself seems to have been wishy-washy about Hadrian, and had been unwilling to commit himself to the young man, even though he was Trajan's only living male relative. Hadrian had enjoyed a good career, and had many doors opened for him by virtue of his relation to Trajan, but he had never received the special exceptions that signaled eventual inheritance. But while Trajan may not have been fully sold on his cocky, promiscuous, Philhellene nephew, his wife certainly was, and when the emperor died without leaving clear succession instructions, his opinion, to put it bluntly, no longer mattered. The official rumor is that when Trajan died, Pompeia quickly hushed up the death, and may have gone so far as to hire an actor to lay in the vacated deathbed pretending to be the emperor for the purposes of issuing the final recommendation that Hadrian ought to succeed him. While the veracity of this story is hard to pin down, the letters arriving in the Senate announcing the last wishes of Trajan and the adoption of Hadrian were all signed by Pompeia, a singular occurrence in the whole of Trajan's reign, leading most to suspect that the empress authored the orders herself. Pompeia, though, was not acting out of the pure self-interest that had driven, say, Agrippina. Sure, she knew that her own position would be secure if Hadrian became emperor, but more important than that was assuring that the transfer of power was seamless and left no openings for civil war. Her husband may have been fantasizing about following Alexander the Great one last time and leaving the empire to the strongest. But Pompeia was not about to let the Roman world be sucked back into the abyss of self-destruction. News of the emperor's death was kept tightly under wraps until Hadrian's position was secured. And when word finally did make it back to the capital, it arrived at the same time as news that the legions in the east had gone ahead and declared Hadrian imperator. The Senate and any possible pretenders to the throne were thus forced to deal not with a power vacuum, but a fait accompli. Hadrian is already the new emperor. Deal with it. Even without his future success coloring our view of his being named heir, Hadrian was as good a candidate for power as anyone else out there. He was 41 years old, well beyond the reach of the youthful excesses that had ruined Caligula and Nero, had ample military experience at the highest level, had governed provinces, and was, of course, the sole living male relative of the deceased emperor. He was not by any means the only man who eyed the death of Trajan with ambition, but there was never any doubt after Trajan's initial ascension that his younger cousin and former ward would be on the short list of candidates to succeed him. In other words, when the Roman world found out that Trajan was dead and Hadrian had succeeded him, there was a feeling that, well, yeah, that makes sense. Publius Aelius Hadrianus was born on January the 24th, 76 AD, into a Spanish-Italian family of senatorial rank. There is some disagreement about whether he was born in his hometown of Italica, near modern-day Seville, or whether he was actually born in Rome while his parents were in the capital on business, but the latter smells a lot like post-imperial revisionism, so I tend to go with the former, even if there's no real proof of it one way or the other. Italica was a Roman city in Spain that had been founded by Scipio Africanus to house his injured veterans after he'd completed his clean sweep of the Iberian Peninsula and needed to get going on his invasion of North Africa. Hadrian's family, like Trajan's, had migrated from Italy not long after the colony's foundation, and both quickly became members of a new Spanish-Italian aristocracy, an aristocracy fueled by the lucrative Spanish olive oil trade. Hadrian's father was a well-regarded senator, like his neighbor and cousin Marcus Ulpius Traianus, the future Emperor Trajan. The elder Hadrian served with distinction across the empire, eventually rising to the rank of praetor, before he died unexpectedly in 86 AD, while still in his mid-40s. Hadrian was only 10 at the time, and as the only male in line, he was thrust into the role of paterfamilias at an incredibly young age. But since he was still a minor, and everyone fretted about boys who grow up without strong male guidance, Hadrian's education was entrusted to his cousin Trajan, who was fast Italian noble named Publius Aetianus, who will play a key, if infamous role, in Hadrian's early administration. Young Hadrian was educated in classic Roman fashion, and the zeal the boy showed for all things Greek, literature, philosophy, art, whatever, earned him the nickname Graeculus, which meant Little Greek or Greekling. It was a mildly disparaging nickname, as the typical Roman aristocrat studied Greek culture, yes, but kept the sensuous and corrupting passions of the East at arm's length. Hadrian, though, embraced all things Greek, and for the rest of his life idolized and sought to emulate his heroes, Homer and Xenophon and Plato. The villa complex he would build for himself after becoming emperor was nothing less than a massive homage to the Greeks in its architecture, landscaping, and underlying philosophic principles. When Hadrian was 14, Trajan brought him to Rome to personally supervise the last stages of the boy's education and oversee his transition to manhood. Trajan was just completing the consulship he had been awarded by Domitian for his rapid response to Saturninus's revolt, and the teenage Hadrian found himself planted right smack dab in the middle of Roman power politics. At this point, there would have been little reason for Hadrian to dream that he might himself don the purple one day, but his close relationship to Trajan meant that he was definitely being prepared for an important role in the imperial system somewhere, so he best pay attention. Living in Rome during the last years of Domitian's reign, not that anyone knew that they were the last years of Domitian's reign, gave Hadrian a close-up view of what to do and what not to do with power, and his later conduct hints that he learned his lessons well, even if there were a few growing pains at first. Through the influence of Trajan, Hadrian received 3 consecutive military tribuneships in Pannonia, Moesia, and Upper Germany successively. It was unusual for a young aristocrat to serve even 2 consecutive tours, as most simply did their year's service and went back to the comfort of their estates. But Trajan was obviously intent on instilling Hadrian with all the martial virtues that he himself so prized. For his part, Hadrian seems to have been an excellent and well-liked soldier. He enjoyed camp life. The camaraderie, the attention to detail, the rigorous exercise, all appealed to him, and for the rest of his life, he was able to come and go from legionary camps with ease, speaking the language of his soldiers and willingly sharing in their hardships. Though he is remembered today as the quintessential pacifist emperor, Hadrian always loved military life, and his troops, in turn, always loved him. It was while he was serving his second tribuneship in Moesia that Hadrian learned that his elder cousin had been adopted by Nerva, and it was while he was serving on his third tour in Upper Germany a few months later that he learned that the old emperor was dead, and Trajan now ruled in his own right. Tradition has it, as I mentioned, that it was Hadrian himself